Good morning, everybody, and as I stare at 12 pages worth of questions, I wonder how many we'll get through in this particular episode of the Drydock. Well, time's a wasting, let's get on with it. Well, first of all, shout out to a couple of the first subscribers to this channel who have put in questions, so let's get on to their questions. Diego Salvati asks, how effective was submarine warfare in World War One compared to World War Two? Not just the German Navy, but also the Austrian, American, and by effective, I mean how much did it impact the war effort of the country's enemies compared to the cost of maintaining the necessary numbers of submarines? Well, initially, submarine warfare was actually significantly more effective than it was in World War Two, mainly because no one had any idea how to actually deal with it. In World War Two, it was fairly obvious from the lessons of World War One that you needed a convoy system. Obviously, submarines had advanced in technology, but convoys with escorts were rolled out pretty much immediately, whereas in World War One, due to a combination of one, trying to remember that convoys had actually existed in the past to deal with merchant raiders, and also just the resources required in terms of escorts, the convoy system wasn't implemented until after the Battle of Jutland. So initially, submarine warfare was fairly effective with a lot of easy pickings. Now, that isn't to say submarines had it all their own way. In World War One, many submarines carried few torpedoes. They were very slow underwater. They had limited range. So a lot of submarine warfare early on consisted of surface submarines actually engaging with their deck guns, which against the odd merchant ship wasn't really much of a risk, saving your torpedoes for the more lucrative targets and the odd warship. But obviously that's when you had Q ships coming in and such like. But with that limited range, speed, and firepower, the convoy system was actually significantly more effective against submarines of the World War One era than it was against submarines of the World War Two era, at least when it started up, because submarines that were forced to keep submerged due to the presence of escorts, basically in World War One, you'd miss the convoy at that point. So initially, submarines had to exploit flaws in the early convoy system. Things like the fact that convoys would break up close to the UK and then go to individual ports, and obviously short range submarines, they were kind of operating in that area anyway. So having submarines trying to attack convoys in the middle of the Atlantic didn't really occur too much in World War One because there weren't that many submarines who could do it. The British submarine arm in both wars tended to be hampered somewhat by the fact that Germany and its various allied countries didn't really have that much of a merchant marine to go after. There was some, especially in World War Two, with the Axis trying to run supplies down to Rommel's Africa Corps, but generally the British submarine arm tended to, by default, end up going after enemy warships more often, which obviously is a less common occurrence and more hazardous. The Austro-Hungarian Navy in World War One actually had a relatively good war. They only lost 8 submarines, 3 of which they lost in 1918, in exchange for their submarines sinking a number of fairly large warships, armoured cruisers and such, and damaging others as well as merchant ships. All in all, that was probably the most effective arm of the Austro-Hungarian Navy in their relatively limited conflict in the Adriatic and parts of the Mediterranean. And without diverging off onto every nation's submarine arms, I'll cover the other one you mentioned, which is the American Navy. The American submarine effort in World War One, well, they arrived into the war fairly late. There isn't really much German merchant ship activity off the American coast in World War One, so the American submarine arm didn't really do that much during the First World War. During the Second World War, they generally had the good fortune to land the easy mode of World War II submarine warfare, which was facing Japan and their almost pathological intransigence against doing almost any anti-submarine warfare whatsoever. But they were hampered in the first few years by the absolutely terrible Mark 14 torpedo. And for those of you not aware of that, it was a torpedo that at its core was a fairly functional torpedo, hampered by the fact that virtually every system designed to get the torpedo from point A to point B and then make sure it exploded was completely and royally screwed up by the Bureau of Ordnance, who then stubbornly refused to listen to anybody telling them they might have actually got it wrong until unauthorized testing by various ticked-off American commanders show that, in fact, yes, this torpedo was horribly badly designed. It took the Bureau of Ordnance a total of about a year and a half to finally accept that it had screwed up and fix all of the various flaws in the Mark 14, which adds up to over a third of the time America was involved in the entirety of World War II. But once all of that was fixed, the Mark 14 actually then settled down to being a fairly good, serviceable torpedo, and you see the number of successes by American submariners increase dramatically, surprisingly enough, when they have a torpedo that actually works. Another one of the original subscribers, so shout out to him as well, SSE Weston, says, "Hey Drac, I was wondering what your thoughts would be on how the Battle of the Java Sea would have looked if Prince of Wales and Repulse had not been sunk, but instead retreated to from Singapore altogether and linked up with ABDA Comm. I myself do not know whether they would have been assigned to that particular fleet in our time had they not been sunk, but I suppose this is a what-if more than anything." Now, this is an interesting one because the historical Battle of the Java Sea actually had the Allies with local air superiority during the day because Japanese aircraft couldn't reach the combat area. And with barely 3 months elapsing between the historical sinking of Prince of Wales and Repulse and the actual Battle of the Java Sea being fought, the Japanese would have had to react fairly quickly if the two British battleships had actually stayed in Singapore and then dropped back later on, rather than sailing out on their historic mission where they actually did get sunk. Now, the main outcome, obviously, I mean, if the Java Sea battle went on with just adding those two ships, it probably would have been fairly one-sided. I mean, Prince of Wales and Repulse was both pretty good gunnery ships with fairly up-to-date fire control systems, albeit that Repulse was nowhere near as upgraded as its sister Renown. Both had very competent commanders, and obviously they would have outranked Admiral Dorman, so that Admiral Phillips would have been in command. So, on paper, that would have possibly actually made ABDA Command an effective combat organisation capable of blunting the Japanese attacks in the area. However, with that 3-month gap, if the two battleships, well, battleship and battlecruiser, had actually still been intact, I deeply suspect the Japanese probably would have sent something heavier than some heavy cruisers to combat them. Now, as to what they would have sent, well, Yamato has just come online. However, Nagato and Issei are either about to go into refit or are in refit. So I don't think they'd risk sending a brand new ship like Yamato out on its own, as powerful as it is. Mutsu and Hyunga are kind of, along with, I guess, Fuso and Yamashiro, but even the Japanese didn't really rate them at that point, would kind of be the main strike power of the Japanese battleship force. And with the Americans still having live carriers and other offences going on, I don't think the Japanese would strip those to go down there. However, what was operating in the area were the Congo class, so I would foresee that possibly the Japanese might allocate 2 or possibly more of the Congo class to the force that actually went down to fight the Battle of the Java Sea, which would be especially fitting as well because Repulse and Prince of Wales would be able to outsail, through being faster, any Japanese battleship that wasn't Yamato, which is one that can match the Prince of Wales' speed, and the Congos. So yeah, maybe a couple of Congos would have showed up on the opposite side. Now that would have been an interesting fight, but maybe one for the alternate history video. Joke Franick asks, what's your most aesthetically pleasing warship from battleships, heavy cruisers, light cruisers, and destroyers? Well, for capital ships, I've got to say I'm going to go with either Hood or Vanguard, which is kind of like Hood reloaded. Vanguard there. They kind of just have the right balance for me, although I can understand other people may disagree. Heavy cruiser wise, I think I'm probably going to go with the Baltimore class. They just have that classic heavy cruiser look, and there's something about them just strikes me as sort of like, yeah, that's what a heavy cruiser looks like. For light cruisers, I'm probably going to actually go with the Italian Abruzzi class. They just look really nice, aesthetically, and I guess that was the question. Not necessarily the most effective, but aesthetically they do look really good. For destroyers, I'm probably going to go with the tribal class. I mean, they were big and somewhat overgunned for your typical World War II destroyer, um, but really, they just look really nice, especially the Hyder. Points to the Hyder really, really looks good. I think it's the bow that does it, and the compact superstructure. At least that's for ships that served in World War II. If you ask me to expand that out across the board, who knows? Everything looks so different these days. Krezimir Korzinek, I think, hopefully, says, what do you think of the naval situation in the Mediterranean in 1914? Since the Royal Navy was focused against Germany, obviously there was a lot of competition between France, Italy, and Austria-Hungary for domination of the Mediterranean, and who, if anyone, had the upper hand. And was there any point to the Austro-Hungarian Navy having ships larger than destroyers? So the answer is kind of, in response to the second part of the question, is kind of yes and no. Obviously, the Austro-Hungarian dreadnoughts didn't do all that much in and of themselves during the First World War, but they did have a fairly large effect on the overall balance of naval power in the whole of the First World War, because it forced the French and obviously later on the Italians to keep significant portions of their more advanced pre-dreadnoughts and dreadnought strength in the Western Mediterranean and the Adriatic, just in case the Austro-Hungarian dreadnoughts came out. Now that meant that certain ships weren't available to go after the Goeben initially, and also not available to counter it later on. And it also meant that if you want to really sort of look at the grand strategic picture, that some of those ships, probably more the French than the Italians, could have been redirected to the Atlantic and North Sea operations, possibly joining up to help out with the Grand Fleet, thereby increasing the overall Allied weight of power over the High Seas Fleet significantly if they weren't needed in the Mediterranean. So how good the Corvettes and the Britannias would have been in a battle with the High Seas Fleet remains to be seen. But certainly the Austro-Hungarian dreadnoughts, I think, probably tied down a lot more ships than they are just worth on paper. So yeah, they were probably cost effective from that point of view. And as for the rest of the Austro-Hungarian navy, well, they kind of prevented the Allies from just surging over the Austro-Hungarian Empire in the southwest, sort of with direct naval fire support for the Italian armed forces on land. So yeah, they were probably worth it as far as the Austro-Hungarians were concerned, in that it kind of kept them from being rolled up fairly quickly, which then obviously the collapse of the southern aspect of the Central Powers would have shortened the war quite considerably. The Royal Navy, of course, did maintain a presence in the Mediterranean throughout the war, um, but it was always a complex and shifting scenario, with the Royal Navy, the French, and the Italians responsible for different areas of the Mediterranean, and there often being a lot of sort of low-level conflicts of interest, with the fact that a lot of the commanders didn't speak each other's languages. There was various bits of confusion, which both Austrian and sort of imported German ships did use to exploit and inflict more damage than they realistically should have done. Um, but really, it was kind of, as long as you could keep the Turks on their side of the Dardanelles, and as long as you could keep the Austro-Hungarians vaguely bottled up in the Adriatic, the rest of the Mediterranean was kind of a bit of a quiet zone as far as the First World War was concerned, with the exception of the odd submarine. Graham Baxter asks, what would be your personal biggest missed opportunity, wrong decision, or why didn't they just in naval design? It's always interesting to look at the process and context behind the decisions that history and hindsight reveal to be the wrong choice. Well, I'm gonna put down a sort of a joint entry there. So entry one would be British battle cruiser design in the First World War and just before it. British intelligence was relatively good. They knew the Germans were building pretty fast, fairly well armoured battle cruisers in response to the Invincibles. And whilst, yes, I can see why the Invincible and the Inflexible classes, maybe being first, you're not going to design them in response to their own counters. But by the time you get on to Queen Mary, Lion, Princess Royal, and Tiger, the sort of halfway house approach that they took, with having the bigger guns but not particularly fantastic armor, that was really a bit of a missed opportunity. I mean, not that that necessarily would have saved Queen Mary at Jutland, but it might have led to a more decisive Dogger Bank if Lion had been a bit better protected and not ended up as crippled as it was. So that's one. The other one, I think I'm probably going to lay at the feet of the British again, which was in both World Wars. The rather spectacularly stupid decision, especially when you get to the second, given that they had precedent in the first, of going, okay, well, war has broken out, so we're going to stop all battleship construction because they won't be completed in time, and we're just going to do other things. It meant that a bunch of the R classes didn't get built. The theoretical sixth Queen Elizabeth didn't get built, and we also missed out on at least two of the Lion class, basically because for some reason people kept believing that the war was going to be over really quickly. They really should have known better, and it would have been really interesting, I think, to see those ships completed, especially given the context of the actions they might have taken part in later in the war, both wars. Sir Jim asks, why did it take so long for Royal Navy destroyers to feature enclosed gun houses for their main battery? He mentions that the Battle class in 1943 were the first Royal Navy class to use enclosed gun houses, whereas the Americans started using them in the mid 1930s. Basically, as far as I can tell, there wasn't any particular reason given, more just that an open mount allowed for a little bit more room to maneuver for the crews. They didn't see any particular need for them. Most of the Royal Navy's destroyer mounts were sort of three-quarter mounts, only the back was open, so sort of if it's pointing in the direction of danger, they should be about as well shielded. Obviously, there would be some splinter issues from ricochets and such. But generally, from what I can see, it seems to have been just felt that it would maybe make things a little bit too compact, and that it would possibly be also an unnecessary weight addition. Of course, once you got more and more automated loading procedures and more mechanisms, then you had to protect them from the sea a lot more, and so you started to see obviously the enclosed gun mounts come in. Nathan Britton asks, thanks for answering my last question. I have another one. On the pre-dreadnought USS Kearsarge, it had an unusual secondary arrangement with the 8-inch guns on top of the main batteries. What was the point of that design, and did anyone else use a similar setup? Generally, no, nobody else did, although a number of American pre-dreadnoughts did share this particular little design quirk. As for what was the point of that design, quite a lot of people found themselves asking the same question, including the American Navy. The original idea was to try and get the secondary battery as high up away from the sea as possible, and to also the thinking went that, well, if you're shooting at a pre-dreadnought type target, you probably want your secondary battery pointing in the same direction. So if it's stuck on top of your main battery is going to be pointing in the right direction at least. So that simplifies the problem. And then obviously you could hopefully have a combined salvo. In reality, of course, the combined blast effects of having your main guns and your 8-inch guns so close together didn't really help anybody in terms of accuracy and crew comfort, to say the least. Vibration kind of just threw off the accuracy of the 8-inch guns. It also meant you were very limited in what you could engage, because obviously it turned out that you might actually want to shoot at other targets with your secondary battery. And it also became very confusing because the temptation then was to try and fire the guns as close together as possible. And then you had to try and differentiate between 12-inch and 8-inch shell splashes when they're basically following exactly the same lines, whereas at least if the secondary battery was positioned elsewhere, their fall of shot might have been somewhat distinguishable. Although obviously the Kearsarge class themselves carried 13-inch guns, just to make life difficult for everybody, but the designs were also used on ships with 12-inch guns. Overall, between the Kearsarge and Virginia classes, the United States Navy kind of looked at it and went, yeah, it seemed like a good idea at the time, not really a good idea in practice, and promptly then dropped the idea permanently. Alfredo Sierra, that serial question asker, asks, why hasn't Spain ever increased or modernized its battleship fleet? Was it due to logistical or economical reasons, And if it wasn't any of those, what was it? And if Spain had done so, what possible type of designs would it have built? Well, as far as the battleship fleet goes, Spain really lucked out, unfortunately. I mean, they were a bit of an empire in decline. They got hit pretty hard by the Napoleonic Wars, being on the losing side. Um, their empire didn't really recover much from that, and obviously a lot of their South American possessions went independent during the 19th century. And then to cap it all off, at the end of the 19th century, they ended up in the Spanish-American War, which happened at just the wrong time for them, and their fleet got pretty decimated then. And between all that and a relatively weak economy, the best that they could manage after that was the Hispana class, which we've covered elsewhere, the world's smallest dreadnoughts. But after that, in theory, they could have tried for bigger ones, and they did draw up designs for it, but they just kept getting hit by disaster after disaster. They had economic issues. The Great Depression didn't help. Obviously, they had the Spanish Civil War, also somewhat unhelpful when you're trying to raise money to build warships. And ultimately, with most of its colonial possessions gone, and understanding that its economic power was nowhere near enough to challenge the big nations of Europe and America, there wasn't a fantastic amount of enthusiasm behind it, although they did look into some kind of modified Italian Littorio class in the run-up to World War II, but obviously World War II put the kibosh on that as well. So yeah, basically a combination of not the world's greatest economy and just sheer runs of bad luck. Every time they tried to build a decent battleship, is why Spain's battleship fleet never really got off the ground. But in relation to the last bit of your question, they were trying to build initially sort of Queen Elizabeth derivatives towards the beginning of World War One, although they downgraded them to sort of Queen Elizabeth alikes with 13.5-inch guns. That got scuppered by World War One breaking out with the British obviously cancelling all foreign orders, and as we mentioned a minute ago, they were looking at the Littorio class and the sort of final form of the Scharnhorst-Gneisenau class in the run up to World War II, and then World War II broke out. So yeah, the World War's not really good for Spanish battleship building. Napalm Ratter says two questions. One, how do games affect naval discussions, World of Warships in particular? And two, can you give us more details about the threat of the UK-USA War of the 1920s? Okay, well, question one. World of Warships and other naval games, they do affect naval discussions in that they tend to bring more people to the table in terms of being interested about naval affairs in the first place, which is always a plus. But obviously, a lot of these ships are somewhat different from their historical examples for reasons such as game balance and things like that. You know, is off balance, comrade, and Russian cruiser radars and all that kind of nonsense. So it can give people a slightly biased and unrealistic idea of what ships were competitive, which ships weren't, etc., etc. But on the broader scale, you do have some sort of slightly more realistic games like Rule the Waves for computers, and there's quite a variety of naval tabletop war games with varying degrees of accuracy. So in terms of affecting naval discussions, when you can get your hold on some of the more accurate gaming systems, they can actually help a great deal, because rather than just discussing things in the theoretical, you can actually stick ships that existed and ships that didn't exist, if they're statted up properly, down on the field and see how they would have fared with the wonderful random nature of dice rolling being the randomizing factor. So, yeah, they're quite useful. And as for details about the threat of the UK-USA War of the 1920s, well, this basically comes down to colonial ambitions. At the start of the 20th century, America was very much into its manifest destiny and all that, and they still saw themselves to a great degree as rivals to the British, as the British had the biggest empire. Um, they smacked down Spain. They reckoned they showed the Germans what for in World War One. So it was a case of basically tussle for dominance. America was the big up and coming power. Britain was the sort of the status quo, the existing power, and there wasn't that much standing between the two of them if they decided to start arguing over who should be top dog. So there was a lot of tension, sort of who should own what, who should control what, who should be doing what and where. Should the British have influence in the North and South American spheres, which America kind of wanted to itself, but obviously Britain had colonial possessions in the Caribbean, northern part of South America, and of course there was Canada. Um, so there were an awful lot of potential flashpoints, and the arms race that was curtailed by the Washington Naval Treaty, when you kind of look at the ships that were being built, although the Japanese had these sort of illusions of being one of the top three naval powers, whilst there was a certain amount of attention paid to what they were doing, Britain and America were largely building ships to counter each other's designs because both of them realized that he who controls the seas basically had a boot on the throat of the other's trade and colonial ambitions. And of course, with both powers so large, neither side could let the other side get a decisive advantage. So the real threat was basically one side looking at a forecast and thinking either the other side is going to have a massive decisive advantage in the future, or this is as big as our advantage is going to get, and it's only going to decrease afterwards. So if we're going to go to war at any point, we need to go to war now to maximize our own advantage, which with an uncontrolled naval arms race would have been the spark point, probably would have been some point in the late 1920s. That's why the Washington Naval Treaty was so vital, because by limiting both sides to equal displacements, and with Japan sitting off there with its three-fifths rule as kind of a balancing factor, it meant that neither side would possess the level of firepower and numerical advantage necessary to kind of think about kicking off a war. And obviously, the other side would then have the security of knowing that that their potential opponent wasn't going to get some kind of massive advantage later on either. But yeah, politically it was a real threat, and to be honest, although things simmered down after the Washington Naval Treaty, it was really only after the Second World War that both sides kind of looked at each other and realised, well, for various reasons, that a war between the two was pointless. Well, we are once again running out of time, and I do appreciate this time I have gone on a bit with some of the longer, more complex questions, but we have to address them eventually. So on to some of the shorter ones, try and clear the deck a bit. So Mishno asks, why does the US Navy use the designation CV for an aircraft carrier and the designation V for fixed wing heavier than air squadrons? Well, CV is an extension of the cruiser designations the Americans use, like CA, CL, etc. The V doesn't stand for vessel. It goes back to a certain degree in the 1920s. Specifically, the Secretary of the Navy saying in 1920 that naval warships that were dealing with fixed-wing heavy-than-air aircraft should use the letter V in their designation, and those that were using lighter-than-air aircraft, sort of airships and such, would have a Z. There is some speculation that this might have referred to the French word for sort of flying, which begins with a V. But to be honest, no one really actually knows. You'd have to go back and ask him. So we can guess, but there's nothing definitive. Jerem Cervantes says, is the 460mm anti-aircraft shell of Yamato effective? Well, as kind of covered by the Yamato video, in theory, very spectacular, massive, gigantic, almost 1,000 flamethrowers in the air. In practice, not really. Kind of a bit of a waste of time. They probably would have been better off with a massive shrapnel shell, to be honest. Simon Allen says, did any Navy consider the use of muzzle brakes on their guns? Now, obviously, a muzzle brake on a gun reduces the recoil by redirecting some of the exhaust gases in a direction other than straight forwards, which obviously then exerts a force backwards. And the answer to that is no, partly because relative to the recoil generated by even the largest guns, generally the ship that it was on was far more massive and therefore able to absorb the recoil, and the turrets had enough space, so the crew weren't at too much risk. But also you had the problem of where would you actually vent the gas if any of the gas was directed sideways, where you have twin and triple turrets, etc. You are going to then potentially disrupt the flight of the shells coming out of the guns next to you, and if you direct it down, you are going to be scorching your own deck with an awful lot of fire. I mean, just have a look at something like the Iowas, broadside. You see, that's a lot of flame you probably don't want anywhere near the deck of your ship and possibly people and systems that are on it. Ralph Astley says, has there ever been a naval mutiny in history that you would have joined if you'd been a member of the crew? Oh, well, now there's a dangerous question, isn't it? Probably yes. I'd say maybe two that come to mind. The Potemkin mutiny, because anyone who tries to feed me maggot-infested meat is going to get a sharp rap round the upside of the head very quickly. And secondly, there were a series of mutinies in the Age of Sail Royal Navy, the Nore mutiny being one of them, although probably the one that was the least justified. But that whole series of mutinies over pay, conditions, and general health, basically, they were pretty justified in their complaints. So that one, yeah, I probably would have been part of that. Oh, and yeah, well, okay, I'll throw in a third one while I remember it. The mutiny of the German Navy at the end of World War One, because yeah, being told to basically just go die in a fire to alleviate some political negotiation points at the end of a war that we're very clearly losing. Yeah, I don't fancy that. Thanks. And lastly for this week, Kevin Wilhelmse says, how did the economics work behind the naval arms race between the German Empire and the British Empire? First, what did this involve on both sides economically with respect to raw materials and industries affected? And second, some German battleships had British turbines. How does that work? Thanks and really appreciate the detailed nature of your work. So, the reason some German battleships had British turbines was basically because with the Parsons turbine, Britain led the field, and everyone else couldn't get turbines to work quickly enough without licensing or outright buying the British turbines for a good few years. So it was a case of kind of accept that you are semi-reliant on a British company to keep your ships running until you can figure out turbines yourself, or build whole classes of battleships with a significant tactical and strategic speed disadvantage over the British ships. And the Germans decided that sort of the temporary reliance on British industry would probably be significantly less of an impact on their overall national defence policy than having several classes of battleships that were just flat out slower and less reliable than everybody else's. And in terms of the economics, now this is an interesting point that quite often gets raised in discussions that I end up having about naval history, is the fact that the economics of building battleships don't just come down to have we got enough money and have we got enough steel. It's very easy to point at those and say, oh, well, X nation should be able to outbuild Y nation because they've got more money and more steel, etc., etc. But no, it's a lot more complicated than that. The short form, since we're running out of time now, is that when you're talking about building battleships, there are certain choke points in naval construction, and it's those choke points that actually affect how quickly you can build up a fleet. One of those is how experienced are your dockyards, and therefore how quick can they turn ships out. The British shipyards at the during that arms race, they were just flat out faster. They could turn ships out quicker and in a more complete state than the German shipyards could, which meant that even assuming everything else was equal, the British could have outbuilt the Germans over time because they were just getting their ships in the water quicker, which would have meant they could start more newer ships earlier. And then these other choke point industries. So you got things like turbines and such started off as a choke point, but then not so much because they're used more generally. So in passenger ships and such, so you can divert production a little bit because the lines are available. But when you're talking about battleships, you're talking about things like guns, things like armor grade steel plate in the sufficient thickness and treated to the sufficient degree to form decent armor grade steel. These kind of technologies that are only really applicable to battleships and battle cruisers, and the gun foundries, the armor foundries, etc. They're incredibly specialized industries. They rely on a certain level of output from the naval yards to keep those industries functioning, and without those, you can't build battleships, because if you can build dozens of hulls, but if you can only turn out enough armor grade steel of the sufficient thickness to armor, say, 4 of them per year, that's how many battleships you can build per year. Doesn't matter if you can build 24 battleship hulls if none of them are armored apart from those 4. And similarly with guns and turrets and big rangefinders, things like that, you need to be able to build those. And that's going to be where your limit lies. And that's with the long construction period needed for a lot of those. That's why you see a lot of the time the guns actually start being built before even the ship has been built. They're usually the first things ordered that go under construction. And of course, shipyards. You can have as many shipyards as you like, but you need a shipyard, particularly a slipway, that's big enough to accommodate the battleship you're building. If you have 20 slipyards in your construction area, but only 2 of them are of a size that you can fit a battleship on, then you can only build 2 battleships. And then you've got all the dock infrastructure, cranes and stuff to bring all this heavy equipment in once you've built it. And this is basically what was really the deciding factor in the arms race between the German and the British Empire, because both sides produced more steel than was necessary by a long shot to build the ships. They both had more than enough money, albeit they obviously wanted to spend it on other things. But it came down to essentially the British could flat out outbuild the Germans because thanks to both having maintained a larger navy in the long term and also building for foreign orders, they had more of these gun foundries, armor foundries, and other unique technologies, and all the infrastructure associated with it, which meant they could just put ships in the water faster with all their systems in place. And similarly, that's why you have things like today in America, where you've got Abrams tanks still being built when the American Army doesn't need any more Abrams tanks, because it's a case of you have to keep that industry, that tank building industry going, otherwise it will just go away, and then it's really, really hard to build back up again. Just ask the Germans in World War II about trying to build efficient warship designs. And this also affects a lot of the calculus about potential British-American war in the 1920s and who could build what ships where. Money was more of a deciding factor in that period, but it's also quite interesting to look at the sheer theoretical amount of industrial output both sides had with regards to warships specifically. But now we've run on, and this is probably the longest Drydock episode so far, so I'm going to cut it there. Thank you all for submitting your questions. Please don't stop doing so. Yes, I do have an awfully long list of questions to keep going through, but that means we're never going to run out, and hopefully I've covered most of the backlog, and we're into maybe this week's questions and maybe some of last week's still to go. So thank you very much. Thank you for listening, and signing off again from this episode of the Drydock.